In a previous talk, I was discussing the famous historical quotes, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" being one. That was by Patrick Henry. Another by Emiliano Zapata, which is "It's better to die on your feet than live on your knees." And then one by John Stark, which normally is only read halfway, the beginning half being "live free or die," the second half of that quote being "death is not the worst of evils." And I was discussing the reasoning of these thoughts, right, which are all pretty much saying the same thing, right? It's actually better to die than to live as a slave, is the basic concept. So I'll link to that previous talk in case you're interested in hearing that discussion. In this talk, I'm going to revisit this idea, but add some additional quotes, mainly from the New Testament, that I realized are actually very much related to this concept, and also talk about how Jesus was very much referring to this, I believe, and was actually living by this belief, you could say, which is intertwined with the virtue of courage, because it's actually different forms of fear that could lead someone to not agreeing with this concept, right? I think it's safe to say that someone that's stating things like "give me liberty" or "give me death" or "live free or die" or "it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees," it's appropriate to label these statements as courageous, right? And courage is the opposite of fear. So the New Testament quote that I think is especially appropriate would be from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 4. And the translation I have of that here reads, quote, "In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of endangering your life," end quote. Some translations don't read that clearly in plain English. It'll say "to the point of blood," but that's what it means, right? Like you haven't shed blood over this, or you haven't endangered your life, in the struggle against sin. And the thing to recognize there with that statement is that it's not saying to do so would be a bad thing, right? It's not saying don't endanger your life in the struggle against sin. It's saying more like, what are you complaining about, basically? Or, stop being such a wimp, stop being such a coward. You haven't struggled against sin to the point of actually even endangering your life, right? I think that is a more accurate interpretation. In your struggle, you haven't even resisted to that point yet, which would actually be virtuous for you to do so, right? Would actually be courageous for you to do so. So I believe related to this idea, related to this courageous thought, are some statements that Jesus made repeatedly. Um, and we find these statements in the book of Matthew and Mark in particular. So in Matthew 5:30, we read, "It's better for you to lose part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell." So I think this statement and the one that we find that's very similar in Mark chapter 9, verse 43, and then also in Matthew 18:8, I think this is oftentimes put into an afterlife context because of the word hell that is oftentimes utilized in the English translation. Sometimes it'll say eternal fire. And so I believe the church normally just interprets this as, well, think of the afterlife, right? So it's better for you to face persecution during your life in this body now, because whatever persecution you face for doing the right thing now isn't going to be bad as, you know, eternity in hell, right? So I don't personally believe in this idea of eternal hell. First of all, that doesn't make sense as far as a just God, right? Because justice needs to be proportional. So to face eternal damnation for, you know, a limited number of sins or sin for a limited number of time just doesn't make sense. I would even say that it's a blasphemous idea because it's so clearly unjust. And it's not what Jesus actually taught. I mean, people certainly would like to spin words like these to equate to the statement that yes, there is this eternal place of punishment that you will go to, you know, if you have ever sinned. But returning to the context of courage in our life now, these statements by Jesus here about, you know, it'd be better for you to lose part of your body than your whole body enter into hell. And then in Matthew 18:8, it reads, you'd be better off going into life with injury than have no injury and face the eternal fire. So I think it's important to recognize that there's some symbolism here, or there's some unpacking of vocabulary, right? The word life, I think, makes sense to actually interpret as satisfaction, right? Like, it's not, you're obviously already alive, so what does it mean to go into life if you're already alive? Well, I think a rational interpretation is to see it as a better life or a more satisfying life, right? And the word eternal, too, I think, is basically a mistranslation, and it's more appropriate to think of it as long lasting. You know, the same with eternal flame. It's like saying never ending, but not necessarily in a literal sense, right? Like in conversation, we might say, well, if I don't fix this problem, it's just going to go on forever, right? And that may not be literally true, but we use the language that way. You know, it's never ending. You know, someone might say, "Oh, this problem at work or whatever, this issue that I have, it's never ending." And that might not be 100%, you know, technically true, as in like, yes, for eternity, but we use the term never ending, you know, approximately or symbolically, you know, like It just keeps going on and on and on. The pattern keeps repeating over and over. That doesn't necessarily mean that the pattern can't end, right? Even if the pattern itself has been going on and would continue to go on unless a change is made, that doesn't mean that it's set in stone that it will go on forever, right? If there's a solution to the problem and you utilize the solution, well, then that would end the never-ending problem, right? So it's important to not take these words so literally when it's not true to life, true to language to do so. So when he's talking about going into life and avoiding this never-ending suffering, I think the right way to interpret it as far as the context of our daily lives is going into a greater life, a more satisfying life, and breaking out of these never-ending, quote marks, never-ending patterns in our life, these repeating patterns that are unenjoyable, right? That have, you could say, a fire to them, symbolic of the unpleasantness or the pain, the suffering. So then returning to the original historical quotes, particularly the one by John Stark, which ends with, "Death is not the worst of evils." So if that's true, that would mean that living as a slave or living, with in eternal suffering or never-ending suffering isn't better than just dying, right? And that should make some sense to a listener, right? That should make some sense to us that in certain situations, death would be preferable to suffering, right? A lot of times people make this judgment call with animals that they're the caretakers of, right? If the animal is going through severe suffering and it doesn't seem like there's any way to end the suffering, a lot of the caretakers have made the decision to end the animal's life. They say put the animal to sleep. Right? So they're making a judgment call that the death is actually better than the suffering, right? And as far as freedom goes and its opposite, slavery, it's reasonable, I think accurate to say that it's impossible to be a happy slave. Right? Being enslaved is a condition of suffering. It's unnatural. You're under constant abuse, right? So, that being the case, slavery being a condition of continuous or never-ending suffering, these statements of live free or die and death not being the worst of evils makes rational sense once you get into these particular details and accept them as fact. Then number one, slavery is a condition of never-ending suffering. That would be, fact number one, premise number one. And fact or premise number two being that death would end that situation. So, therefore, conclusion being, well, it'd be better to end a situation of never-ending suffering than continue it because there's no potentiality for happiness in a condition of continuous slavery or continuous abuse. So it's really a cost-benefit analysis going on, right? You're realizing, well, the cost far outweighs whatever benefit, you know. Yes, I'm still alive. You could call that a benefit, but it's a life that is deprived of satisfaction and happiness. So when you take both of those into consideration, which is the winner, right? With analyzing that, which would you choose? And so folks like Emiliano Zapata, Patrick Henry, and John Stark said, well, you can give me liberty or give me death, but I don't choose slavery, right? If you have a choice between liberty, slavery, or death, they're saying, I'll take liberty or death, but you can keep the slavery. Right? In their cost benefit analysis, they're recognizing that the slavery and the never ending unhappiness and suffering that goes with it is not a preferable choice. They'd rather have the liberty, of course, it would be choice number one. But if you can't have that, then they'd take death as the second choice. And the third option of slavery would be a non-option. They're not going to choose option C there. They're not going to choose the third option, right? So returning to the life and words of Jesus, this being a courageous thought that isn't succumbing to fear actually fits with the life and ministry of Jesus, because, I mean, that may already be obvious to you, but I'll just get into the details here in case you'd like to hear. So Jesus obviously wasn't afraid of injury, right? He knew that letting himself be arrested by the Roman authorities, he knew what that was going to lead to, right? That's why beforehand he prayed to his heavenly Father, about this, pass, would you pass this cup of suffering from me only if it's not against your will, but if it is with your will, then I accept it. Right? So he knew what was coming with accepting that arrest and sham of a trial, a sham of so-called justice system that would be utilized. So he wasn't afraid of injury, right? He was willing to face extreme suffering, right? It's hard to imagine any worst possible scenario, right? All of what they call the passion of the Christ, right? All of the torture that he underwent prior to the crucifixion, and then the crucifixion itself being, of course, extremely torturous, extremely painful. So he wasn't afraid of that, right? Because he didn't turn away. He could have turned away, and he even stated that he could have, right? He said, well, I could call on legions of angels to defend me right now, but he chose not to, right? So zero cowardice in the form of fear of injury. Zero. He also had zero fear of humiliation or being shamed, right? Because that came along with his ordeal as well. In Hebrews 12:2, it reads, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. And in Hebrews 13:13, the second half of that verse talks about how a disciple would also bear the disgrace that Jesus bore. Now, when I just said the word disgrace, my fingers just automatically went into air quote motion, because obviously Jesus was not truly a disgrace, right? But he was shamed as if he was a disgrace, right? He was treated as though he was a disgrace, right? So he bore that quote unquote disgrace. But in reality, in God's sight, he wasn't a disgrace at all. Likewise, back to Hebrews 12:2, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. It wasn't real shame, meaning what he did was not actually shameful, right? But he was being shamed, right? People were ridiculing him and, treating him in the worst possible ways, just constantly slandering him during the entire process, right? And he just endured all that shaming with zero fear of it. He wasn't, that wasn't affecting him. He wasn't like, oh, all these people are shaming me, so I'm going to choose to do something different. No, he just stayed the course unwaveringly, right? He had zero fear of this shaming. He had zero fear of humiliation, zero fear of rejection. Right? So this is another major form of fear, the fear of humiliation, or the fear of humiliating rejection, this ashamedness. And Jesus had none of it affecting him, right? Zero. Same with the fear of injury, another one of the other three main types of fear, which we can experience and are often times influenced by, until we follow in the Messiah's footsteps and conquer these forms of fear as well. So the other and last form of fear is the fear of failure, or fear of social failure, which is manifest as inclination to be a conformist, right? So how much of this fear did Jesus have? Once again, absolute zero. He wasn't a conformist at all, right? He was right in the face of the so-called authorities and telling them that they were, hypocrites, calling people, vipers and followers of the devil, even though they thought they were godly, right? So he was not a conformist. He was not afraid of failure in a social sense. He was not afraid of humiliating rejection, and he was not afraid of injury to the point of death, right? So fear of injury includes fear of death, right? Death being, you could say, like the ultimate injury. But if you understand the fact that death is not the worst, to go back to the John Stark quote, if you recognize that that is indeed a fact, not an opinion, but a fact of life, then that particular thought form of the fear of injury wouldn't be influencing you, right? You would be able to conquer that form of the fear of injury, because if the fear is based on the thought, oh, well, you might get hurt, or you might even get killed if you don't accept this abuse, or if, you don't accept conforming to this evil empire, if you don't accept, bowing your knee to the enemy. It's recognizing, well, the injury or death is not actually worse than submission to the evil. And this holds true not only as far as acceptance of evil directed at ourselves or at someone we care about, or anyone, within our cite, a stranger, whoever. It also holds true concerning our own actions. So far I've been talking more about it's better to live free of accepting sin being abuse. It's better to die than to accept that, and recognizing that that actually is a fact of life. But also, it's better to live free of committing sin, or you could say live free of committing sin or die, complementing the live free of accepting sin or die. And Jesus spoke to the living free of committing sin is better than death, very directly and repeatedly. So if it seems like my words are getting kind of convoluted here, just bear with me, because it'll become more clear as I read these verses. So in Luke 17:2, Jesus said, "It's better to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied around your neck than to scandalize a child." So if you're thrown into the sea with a millstone around your neck, you're going to die, right? So to simplify that statement, he's saying it's better to die than to scandalize a child. So what I'm trying to point out here is that accepting abuse should be never seen as an option. And likewise, thinking that it's okay to commit abuse, to continue in sin, is preferable than dying is actually also incorrect. So, again, to restate this in hopefully a more succinct way, it's better to die than to accept abuse. That's statement number one. And it's actually better to die than to continue to commit abuse as well. So whether you're receiving it or whether you're committing it, either way, you're experiencing something, you're living a life not worth living. It's not a life worth living to be accepting abuse or to be committing it, right? And so that's what Jesus was speaking to directly here in Luke 17:2. So there are some other statements by Jesus that are relevant to this discussion, and those can be found in Mark 8:35, Luke 9:24, and Matthew 10:39, and Matthew 16:25. So you may find this verse put under the subheading of "Take up your cross," because in Matthew 10:38, Jesus says, "Anyone who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me." And then in the next verse, 39, "Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." So this is relevant to the discussion, right? Because he's talking about losing your life actually being worth it, right? So giving up your life to gain it. Similarly, in Luke 9:23, Jesus said, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Now, unfortunately, the Paulinist establishment church loves the deny himself portion of it, and they like to harp on that as evidence of your inherited sin and your inherent wickedness, and that's why you need to deny yourself, because your heart is so terrible and horrible. And they just use this as a jumping board to catapult you into their false dogma of blood sacrifice, atonement, and human depravity. What he was actually saying, as far as denying yourself, is being willing to recognize that your normal life is not necessarily more precious than what he's offering. And especially if what you're accepting is, I would say, a form of abuse, right? So you may have to deny the so-called life that you have in order to have a chance at having a real life. So this main idea here of, give up your life to gain it again, we find in Matthew 10:39, 16:25, and then Luke 9:23 through 24, and 8:35. And I think it relates again to this whole issue of life and death, and when is death actually preferable to life. And I think there is a clear answer to that, and it has to do with freedom, and it has to do with virtue and sin, right? Again, being subject to abuse, which is evil, is not, it does not constitute a life worth living. And likewise, if you're committing the abuse, like Jesus said, it would actually be better for you to drown in the sea than to be a partaker in that. And that could be talking in part about the afterlife consequences, certainly, but it's relevant to us even on a more immediate scale, I believe. That if we want to just have a satisfying life now, we need to repent of our sins. We need to change our way of thinking away from adherence to sin, like the sin of fear. Fear is a sin. Mainstream society will tell you otherwise. It'll constantly bombard you with the false equivalency of fear and the crisis response of the body to make you believe that fear is sometimes beneficial. Fear is demonic. Fear is cowardice. And Jesus doesn't call us to be cowards. Actually, in Revelation, it's interesting that in a list of people that are kept outside the gates, guess who Jesus puts first on the list? Cowards. So, if you think fear is, sometimes good, sometimes bad, as mainstream society has been telling you, I encourage you to think more deeply about that. And I've delved into the devil and the details there myself, and written a guidebook on conquering all forms of fear, if you're interested, and have other audios. But one of the main lies, along with the lie that fear is actually the body's crisis response, otherwise known as the fight or flight response, which is physiological. Along with that false equivalency telling you that the emotion thought of fear is equivalent to a body, the beneficial physical responses of the body. Along with that lie, there is this other lie that being a slave and being injured or even being killed is something you want to avoid at all costs, even if the cost is being a coward, even if the cost is being enslaved, right? Being a slave is not preferable to death, right? And that's why the fact is that death is not the worst of evils, as the historical quote I mentioned previously states, along with the Emiliano Zapata quote of, it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees, right? He's stating a fact. Many people might just see it as an opinion, but it's actually a fact, just as the statement by Jesus that it's better to die than be a sinner that just keeps on going on sinning, doing horrible things. These are actually facts of life, not just opinions. And so when you get those facts straight, then when the lies that are coupled with these fearful thoughts, when these lies arise with that emotion of fear in your mind, you can rebuke them and affirm the truth and thereby conquer those forms of fear and no longer be influenced into being cowardly. And by so doing, we can follow Jesus and his callings and take up our cross daily as he taught us to do. All right, I hope you found some of this perspective valuable. Thank you for listening.